Welcome to Missing the Mark, where we look for meaning in strange places. I'm Christopher. I'm rapidly losing interest in response videos, but a recent video by Logicked has two things in it which I think are worthy of an exception. The greater in importance is that I misspoke when quoting Jacqueline Glenn. Here's what I said. In the first minute, she said first that atheism is not a position, it's merely a lack of belief, and then answered the second question with, well, you can't hate somebody that you don't think exists. And so in just a moment, she then claimed that God, based her argument on God not existing.
Yes.
And as he put it, she couldn't go 17 seconds without this. And Logic objected to my objection to this as gravely in error. He wasn't entirely correct about this, as Rob from Deflating Atheism points out. Belief is in general all probabilistic, and you can probabilistically hate someone you think might exist. That said, the legitimate part of Logic's objection to what I said is in error as to Miss Glenn because I misquoted her. She did not say that, well, you can't hate someone that you don't think exists. She actually said,
Number one, we can't hate something that does not exist.
This is what the rest of my commentary, which I was myself quoting from an agnostic friend, was about, and she clearly was inconsistent with her earlier statement that atheists merely lack a belief that God exists. I don't think any blame attaches to Logicked for not verifying my quotation before commenting on it, and certainly no blame attaches to him for not being familiar with Miss Glenn's body of work. The only blame here attaches to my misquotation, for which I apologize. The other thing worthy of comment is this.
The guess must refer to the only interaction we've ever had, which is the statement from Deflating Atheism that he finds it easy to lose sight of the fact that atheists' lives matter, and so he starts seeing us as cockroaches who need to be stamped out just for disagreeing with him on the internet. I don't see much nuance there. It seems pretty clear-cut what was being said, but apparently you, Chris, with your big, smart Christian brain, see some sophisticated nuance there that turns it into a funny joke somehow. Now, I can't help it, Chris, if God made me a poor, dumb, ignorant atheist. So could you please help a guy out and point out how he didn't say what he literally said? Thanks.
This is a request for help, if granted a sarcastic one, but I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt and assume that he's only being sarcastic because he doesn't believe that there is any possible answer, and that if he did believe that, his request would be real. Yeah, I know, but it's not impossible. So, let's look at the original statement. Ultimately there is, there are a lot of interesting things to say about atheists, or atheism precisely because essentially at the end of the day, one values atheists. They're human beings, they're worthwhile, and therefore, their lives actually matter.
Which is very easy to lose sight of when you're in a position like I am, and you're constantly debating them. You see them almost as cockroaches that need to be stamped out. Quite honestly, no. I mean, yeah. I feel like I'm a bad critic because I feel no agape love for these people. I consider them pests.
Yeah,
quite honestly.
As a warning, my explanation of this exchange is going to be very long, and I will note for the atheists chomping at the bit to be the first to say something stupid about this, it will not be long because this requires a lengthy defense in order to not mean what Logic took it to mean, but because I am going to break it down into little pieces so simple that even a man with extraordinary and oft-applied skill in missing the point of everything he hears should be able to understand when I'm done. The first thing to take note of is that Rob begins with, which is very easy to lose sight of. He is, thus, describing a failing on his part. This means he does not endorse what he will describe this failing as, but rather is condemning it. This means his subsequent comments must be read in light of his disapproval. Next, he sets the scene which leads to this mistake, constantly debating them. That is, the thing which makes him lose sight of the value of each individual atheist is argument, and specifically seeing the same bad arguments over and over again. Worse, and this is, granted, a benefit of having personal experience with this as I do, not only are the arguments all the same, but their expression is all the same. Online atheists tend to use the same words to make the same arguments to such a degree that it is a running joke among many Christians I know that atheists use a common script in the manner of telemarketers. This constant repetition of the same arguments in the same words makes it difficult to remember that each man saying them is actually a different man. It is all too easy for the man to fade, and only the argument to stand out. There is actually a further psychological problem, which plagues people who engage large numbers of people who aren't highly distinct from each other. It's very easy to get frustrated with people for not remembering what you actually told somebody else. This is a broader problem than just with argumentation. Clerks who deal with the public in government offices can easily forget that the 1000th time they've answered the same question is the first time the person in front of them right now has asked it. This is the phenomenon to which Rob is referring, the blurring of the individual humanity of each interlocutor because of the dulling effect of repetition. This is why he described answering their arguments as squashing them like cockroaches. Next, we must look at the tense he's using. It is the present tense. Actually, it is a mixture of the present progressive and the present, though that's immaterial to the moment. He isn't talking to atheists right now, so it cannot be literally in the present. It must, therefore, be metaphorically in the present. And this is a common construction in English. We could call it the generic present. It is describing things which have happened and may happen again, using the present tense in order to invoke the feeling of being in one of these occurrences. This is, in fact, an extremely common way of describing a feeling, which is further confirmed when he later repeats the meaning, explicitly describing it as a feeling. More on that in a bit. Because this is the generic present, it refers both to things which may happen again, but critically, to things which have already happened. So, what has Rob done that his words might be referring to? Rob has answered many atheists' arguments with words, I believe primarily in YouTube comments, his YouTube channel being somewhat secondary. But he has not, to my or anyone else's knowledge, killed so much as a single atheist. This makes murder ineligible as the referent to which his words pointed. There is a further point which needs consideration in order to put this together. Why does one squash a cockroach? It's not because cockroaches are in themselves bad, because, in general, they do not bite living flesh. They do, however, carry diseases. One squashes a cockroach, therefore, not because the animal itself is harmful, but because it carries diseases which are harmful. The object of the squishing is actually to suppress the disease carried. Putting all this together, the squashing of the cockroaches he described clearly means definitively answering the bad arguments being put forward over and over again, without concern for how well the man understands the refutation of the argument or how much he benefits. There is a direct analogy to squashing cockroaches to prevent the spread of disease because the cockroach, being a creature of God who only accidentally carries disease, has intrinsic value. Bad arguments, by contrast, are the creations of men and have no inherent value, since by virtue of being bad arguments, they do not point to the truth. While an atheist would not recognize this distinction, it was a Christian speaking, and he would recognize it. Why it is legitimate to squash cockroaches, but not legitimate to ignore the understanding of the man being answered, is because men are more valuable than cockroaches. Analogizing answering arguments without regard to the benefit of the man to squashing a cockroach to prevent disease highlights how off this approach is. At this point in the interaction, I chuckled heartily because I recognized the feeling of exhaustion at the mind-numbing repetition of bad arguments. It does wear one down. Human beings often laugh when they hear an experience they would have difficulty putting succinctly into words, described vividly by another human being. Now, Rob took my laughter to mean that I thought he was exaggerating the extent of his failing, because he immediately contradicted such an assumption with the words, "Quite honestly, no, I feel like I'm a bad Christian because I feel no agape love for these people." Now, at this point, for the sake of non-Christians, I'll define agape, which is a kind of love. If you want a more in-depth, but still very accessible treatment, I recommend the book The Four Loves by C.S. Lewis. The four kinds of love are agape, friendship, familial love, and erotic love. Agape is generally defined as the love of God, but more generally accessible would be generous love. That is, willing the good of the other for the other's sake. teaching a man that you will never meet again how to fish so he can feed himself. That sort of thing, where you derive no benefit, you give to the other out of your own excess purely for the other's sake. It is, of course, possible to give to someone in order to feel good about yourself. This is, by definition, not agape. Agape is, by definition, only where the object of your will is the other's benefit. And here it should be noted that there was a problem in what Rob said, though I don't know whether it was really a problem in what he meant. It's all too easy to misspeak during a live event. Agape is not a feeling. It is an act of the will. If a man utterly repulses you, but you do something for his sake anyway, that is agape love. If you enjoy every moment of being around a man, but do nothing to benefit him, that is not agape. Feelings are utterly irrelevant to whether something is or is not agape. All that matters is the object at which the will is directed. I'm sure that someone will bring up the question, how do you know you're really intending someone else's good versus some other, meaner motive? But while it's a very important question psychologically, it's not relevant to the moment. What something is, and whether we can know that it is that thing, are separate issues. So now that we have agape defined, we can look at what Rob meant by, I feel like I'm a bad Christian because I feel no agape love for these people. First, we have the repetition of his previous sentiment emphasizing that he's talking about a feeling, which confirms that the previous sentence was in fact describing a feeling. Second, we have confirmation that he is being distracted by the repetition of arguments into ignoring the man who is making the arguments and forgetting the benefit that man is deriving from having his bad arguments answered. He is paying attention only to answering the argument itself, almost as if the argument made itself, and there is no unique image of God, that is, man, who made it. This makes him feel like he is a bad Christian because the point of Christianity is to restore our relationship to God, specifically to accept his outpouring of generous love into us by being the images of him he made us to be. Image here being in the Greek sense of icon, that is, not visual but rather in a fuller sense. In particular, that God pours into us being, to make that concrete, knowledge and happiness and time and so on, and as images of God, we are to then pour from that inexhaustible source into each other. That is the Christian meaning of charity, which is just the English cognate of the Latin charitas, or caritas, which is a translation of the Greek agape. That is why Rob, who was thinking not of the man's benefit but merely of the argument, was failing as a Christian. He was thinking as men think, and not as God thinks. It's a problem all Christians struggle with in various ways and to various degrees. And then there is his final statement. I consider them pests, quite honestly. Now here we do come to the possibility of a literal reading in which it is at least theoretically possible that he means that atheists are in fact insects. In light of everything which was just said before, I see no grounds upon which such a reading could be justified, and moreover I'll note that if you ask Google to define pest, the first definition it gives is a destructive insect or other animal that attacks crops, food, livestock, etc. So to take this sort of literal meaning, you would need to explain how he thinks that atheists attack crops, food, livestock, and so forth. And of course, the first informal definition given is an annoying person or thing, a nuisance. So to take this literally, you'd have to argue that off the cuff, he had in mind the formal and not informal definition of the word. Interpreted in light of his former statements, the formal definition requires quite a stretch of the imagination. But even if we were to grant that he literally meant that he considers atheists to have exoskeletons made of chitin, and apparently are at the largest about a pound or two in size, given the present concentration of oxygen in the atmosphere, and the inefficiency of gas exchange in spiracles, to say nothing of the problems of not having arteries and veins in which to circulate their hemolymph, even supposing for the sake of argument that he means all this, all of it is something which he said he considers himself a bad Christian for feeling. At the wildest extent of dubiously sane literality, this would still be a description of how he is led astray by frequent exposure to atheists. And the very fact that he is presently critiquing himself in this fashion indicates that it is not his considered opinion, but rather something that he occasionally falls into when exposed to the temptation. That is, even on this absurdly literal interpretation of his words that requires forgetting his previous words, he is still describing the feeling of a particular experience. Ultimately, I do not think it is tenable to ignore his previous words. The flow of his speaking is too continuous for there to have been a significant change in subject. But even granting literalism stretched to its breaking point, there is no way to legitimately interpret this as being about genocide, even a wished-for genocide rather than an intended genocide. In short, you have to put the idea of killing atheists in order to get it out again. I should also note that the killing interpretation requires an odd sort of pseudo-literalism. An actually literal interpretation of, which is easy to lose sight of when you're in a position like I am and you're constantly debating them and you see them almost as cockroaches that need to be stamped out, would be, which is easy to stop seeing with the viewer's eyes when you, the viewer, are located in a physical place similar to the one I am located in, and you, the viewer, are debating the atheist without ever stopping even to eat or to use the bathroom, and light bouncing off the atheists and entering the viewer's eyes register in the viewer's brain as looking similar to a cockroach which you, the viewer, need to step on until its exoskeleton is crushed. That is an actually literal interpretation of those words. Alternatively, instead of being addressed to the viewer, one could take it as being addressed to me personally. In neither case would a literal interpretation be about Rob, since he used the second person. That logic takes this to be about Rob killing atheists, and not about the viewers of the livestream or me hallucinating that the atheists physically present to us during that chat looked like dangerous cockroaches to us, means that Logicked is not, in fact, interpreting the words according to their literal meaning. He too is interpreting them non-literally. He's just interpreting them very badly. Anyway, I hope that this helps, if not Logicked, at least people who don't have a financial incentive to misunderstand what others say. Until next time, may you hit everything you aim at.